Thank you very much. Thanks to Fulbright for this opportunity and the opportunity to travel to Washington DC to undertake my Fulbright experience. So where I was based, I was at the Urban Institute in Washington, which is, I don't know if any of you know it, is downtown in the middle, in the heart of Washington DC. And when we went there, it was in winter. And we were warned that by someone at Fulbright, I think at that stage, said DC in winter can be very brutal, and it was reasonably brutal. I did return a few years later in springtime, and it was fantastic. But where I worked was at the Urban Institute. The Urban Institute was founded to bridge the gulf between the lonely scholar in search of truth and the decision maker in search of progress. And I think that's quite a nice way of putting it, and it's a sort of almost the philosophy of what I've been interested in, which is bringing together, notion of truth or researching what is and what should be, and then combining that with practical application, and that's really the heart of where my work has been focused. So I had the pleasure of working with someone called Harry Hattery at the Urban Institute, who's well known in the field of public, the sort of obscure theoretical field of public administration anyway, around the measurement of outcomes. And I don't know how many of you know about this somewhat arcane area, but because you're from Wellington, presumably it does impinge on your lives. I see people nodding their heads. But it's really the issue I'm interested in is really how we measure outcomes, particularly in the public and community sectors, how we measure, attribute and hold people to account for outcomes of any type. So that was where I was based. We were just a little couple of anecdotes, had a lot of fun there. It was cold. My very small son at that stage was just 2 3/4, and he'd always, in New Zealand, resistance to putting on hats. Children don't like to put on woolly hats, and he was one of those children, just don't want to put a hat on. But when we took him down the elevator and took him out and pushed him onto the street the first day into the snow, grabbed the hat and pulled the hat on, and the hat never came off for the rest of our outdoor experience in Washington. And we found the Smithsonian Institutes. And found a lot of really exciting stuff over there, in addition to doing outcomes, and met up with some colleagues, had the experience of going to American Evaluation Society conferences and talking about these arcane and delightful matters to people who, like myself, are pretty obsessed with them. My background is I'm a psychologist originally, and I remember when I was doing my clinical psychology training, we came up with this idea of what is psychology about, and psychology is about, one of the takes on it was about rigorously dealing with the ambiguous, and that's really what it could be a theme for my work around outcomes. It's the great thing about the private sector. It's pretty straightforward measuring outcomes, in that you have a common metric which is delivered periodically, at least every year, which is net profit, and so the outcome problem is difficult, but it's ameliorated by this single measure which is provided sort of every year to assess how people are going. The public sector is not like that, much more complicated. Many outcomes, trade-offs between outcomes, dispute about outcomes, hard to measure outcomes, and hard to attribute outcomes. So I sort of bring that dealing with ambiguity into my outcomes work. I worked as a program evaluator in Auckland for a long time, in hard to measure community programs, figuring out what their outcomes are. And this was the period when Wellington had kind of forgotten about outcomes. I don't know if anyone's old enough in the room to remember that time, but from about 87 to 2000, Wellington wasn't really interested in outcomes. Wellington was interested in outputs. And there were sensible reasons for that, because they're tractable, you can measure them. What happened in Wellington in about 2000 was the public sector became interested in outcomes. There was a global push around outcomes. This outcomes thing got onto the agenda, and I was heavily involved in that, working on managing for outcomes at various levels. And then I've brought this together in this notion of outcomes theory and this planning approach, which we're now involved in. On my Fulbright, I further codified my work in outcomes theory, which I'd already been doing, and made links with the outcomes and evaluation community in the US. And since then we've done additional development of outcomes theory. I'll be talking about some of that today. Further development of an applied approach, because there's no point in just having theory unless it's applied. It's a great social scientist, Kurt Lewin, one of my kind of heroes, and he said there's nothing so practical as a good theory. There's nothing so practical as a good theory. And I think we need to take our theories and make them practical. So we've developed not only theory but a practical approach. And then we found a niche for a piece of software to implement that approach and develop this DoView software, which I'll talk briefly about at the end. So I'm going to be talking about outcomes theory and its application, and secondly, DoView visual outcomes planning. Now this is a real luxury for me, this seminar. Normally I spend my time talking about the stuff all of us have to talk about in Wellington, which is, you know, the nitty-gritty of how we measure outcomes and all. And I don't, you know, I find it very interesting, but it is kind of hard work, and sometimes it's a little dry, you know. So what I thought for this seminar is I'd actually talk a little bit about the wider possibilities of outcomes theory, how it could be applied to some wider issues, not just the nitty-gritty, the mechanics of how we administer government. Although these issues do relate very closely to how we administer government, but they're more the issues which are in the newspaper from time to time. So let's jump in. So we're going to look at outcomes theory. So this is just from Wikipedia. Outcomes theory is, it theorizes a subset of topics covered in diverse ways in other disciplines such as performance management, organizational development, program evaluation, policy analysis, economics and social sciences. The different treatment of outcomes issues in the different technical languages in these disciplines means it's hard for those building outcome systems to quickly gain access to a generic body of knowledge on how to set up outcome systems. So we've got, you know, the idea of people talking past each other. At the moment we have economists talking about agency theory, and we have public sector, well, you have myself, an evaluator, talking about attribution. We have organisational people talking about outcomes. We have strategic planners, and we have HR people. So all these people are talking different languages, and we don't have a common language to actually enable people to share experiences across different domains dealing with the same issues. And that's really what I'm interested in developing this outcomes theory. So what does outcomes theory consist of? Any theory consists of frameworks, principles and definitions, and we've got all of those things in our theory, since it's a nice little theory. I'm not going to talk about the frameworks today because basically they're a little bit boring, but this is the kind of stuff. The frameworks consist of things like this, which we could run a whole day workshop, and these are the basic building blocks of what we call an outcome system. So you can think of these as kind of analogous. If you have an accounting system, you'd have to have building blocks: double entry, bookkeeping, assets register, etc. And under an outcome system, you need to have some building blocks of those systems. As I said, I'm not going to talk about them, but outcome systems are really what people need underneath all this talk about outcomes and doing the outcomes reporting. So what I'm going to do is move on from that nitty-gritty stuff, which I have to talk about all the time, and which is all good when I'm getting paid to talk about it. But today, since I might get a cup of tea and a biscuit afterwards, but today I thought I'd just branch out a little bit. So what I'm really trying to achieve with outcomes theory is identify a set of principles which are generally applicable. So what I want to do is identify a couple of those principles for you, and then see how they could apply in a couple of interesting areas. So these are the types of principles. Outcomes models should, being represented to stakeholders, should be simple but not simplistic. There's another one called equality of input, equality of outcome, level playing field. We'll talk about that. All outcomes models all levels of an outcomes model should be visible, and then there's another one down the bottom there. So basically I'll be talking about some of these principles, and just so you can understand what I'm talking about, we have the notion of an outcome system. So just under any talk about outcomes, there needs to be a system which systematizes your thinking, and also secondly we have this idea of an outcomes model. And one of the key points about outcomes theory is it's very efficient to visualize outcomes within a visual structure. So I don't know, everyone put up their hand who's looked at a long list of like KPIs or indicators. Everyone, people in the room? Yeah. Well, normally what happens in life, in my kind of working life, is you walk into a room and someone says, here are our KPIs, which are the uninitiated key performance indicators. Although you're from Wellington, you probably have that tattooed on your chest somewhere. You get a spreadsheet. I went into Lynn's and we had a spreadsheet of about 250 indicators. And the idea is that some human, I'm a psychologist, remember originally, so the idea is some human being can process this and somehow understand what 250 indicators mean in terms of a structure of what you're measuring is just not credible. But the point is we all play this kind of Emperor's New Clothes game where none of us are willing to admit that we really can't grasp what these 250 things are measuring. People often I get these things coming from overseas, from Mauritius and place, government reports, or as in Indonesia the other day, had 4,000 outcomes. 4,000 outcomes. Now, how any human being could ever process 4,000 outcomes is, you know, obviously utterly impossible. So, and that's what we call cognitive load. And what we're trying to do in this business is reduce the cognitive load of dealing with this outcomes problem, because it's intractable otherwise. But the main impediment is no one's prepared to admit that they can't understand any of this stuff, and we play this weird game where we all think that someone in the room's on top of it, but usually no one is actually on top of it. So I want to use some outcomes theory principles to illustrate the fact that it applies in a number of fields beyond simple organisational planning. So here's one. We've got visualisation of outcomes models is usually more efficient than the traditional text and table approach. Okay, so that's really just that, what I've just said. The principle is that it's much faster and more efficient to do it within an outcomes model. When you're talking about indicators, but also when you're just talking about strategy. Normally people have a strategic plan, 10 or 20 pages or maybe 50 pages, much more efficient to visualise it into a structure. And just a very trivial, sort of small example of it, at the local church where my family have gone for almost for a century now, I must admit, yeah. I'd helped them do the strategic plan, and we stuck this visual model up on the wall. And what happened was that people started writing on the model and said, have you thought about this? One part was the church is a historic church, and they started scrawling, have you thought about the church being a historic church? Now, I love that, because the point was, if we had a 10-page, 20-page normal strategic plan like churches and schools and everybody has, no one would have read it, no one would have commented, no one would have felt entitled to have a go at this plan. But because it was visualised as a poster, people thought that it was theirs and they could have a go, and that's typically what we find from a simple example like a church right through to a global enterprise that we might be involved in. So first point is visualisation is really powerful. The next one is that outcomes models should be simple but not simplistic. And so what I'm going to talk about here does, you know, is kind of will seem like applied common sense, but it's breached very, very often. So at the moment, these models of what we're trying to do in terms of our outcomes, particularly when we move into visualization, tend to be either overly simplistic or overly complex. So we've kind of got the worst of both worlds. We've got things that are too simple and too complex, and what we're after is a sweet spot between those two things. So I get a ring from a large organisation, billions of dollars, that rings, you know, got billions of dollars and thousands of employees. The chief executive wants all of our outcomes to fit on an A3. You know, insistent on A3, you know, A3, that's A3 size piece of paper, that they wanted all their outcomes. And this is as mad as saying that the chief executive wants the entire accounting system on an A3. Because the point is, now, there's nothing wrong with a summary. You have a summary of accounts, you have a summary of your outcomes. But the idea that what happens is you cram it all, and exactly this happened, we tried to cram it all onto an A3, and then people just sort of cross things out and throw them away. There's no notion of having a system underpinning that. So if you nothing wrong with an A3, an A5 or whatever, summary of your outcomes, but it needs to be a summary which lies on top of a model, and I think a visual model, a clickable visual model is the most powerful way of communicating that. So really, this is what we get, and so we get all these, and this also translates into the vision statement. You know, who's been in one of those vision statements? Yeah. Now the problem with that is you're trying to cram into a few words, and particularly these days with the soundbitism, you know, and everyone's attention span is down to about 2.5 seconds. The comms people say you can't do that, you can't get it shorter, shorter, shorter. So we're sitting in a room trying to get 7 words, which somehow encapsulate the entirety of our organisation. Again, a completely mad kind of enterprise to be involved in. So we don't want to go down the oversimplicity line. What we want to do is also, however, avoid the overly complex. And here's one of these ones. So this one is produced by in Afghanistan for the military to figure out what their planning was and what they were doing. Now it was described, General McChrystal described it, when we understand that slide, we've won the war. So. And someone else, yeah, now one comment like that from a leader can actually put back, I see myself as on a bit of a visualization mission. What we're trying to do, we've got sort of, I think it's almost a 10-year program to introduce people to the idea of visualization and the power of visualization and outcomes. One comment like that can, you know, put the whole enterprise back years. Just one leader in a leadership position ended up in the New York Times and all over the place. One comment like that holds the entire enterprise at jeopardy. It's shocking, yeah. So So what we've got to do is avoid that at all costs, even if we cut a few corners and keep things a little bit. We don't over complexify. Now, what the New York Times article said, it was they immediately associated this with PowerPoint, but in actual fact, it's got nothing to do with PowerPoint whatsoever. Because if you think about it, that diagram almost certainly wasn't drawn in PowerPoint. If you know what I mean, it's there's all those lines and stuff. Now, if you drew it, you'd be a bit of an idiot to draw it in PowerPoint. You'd be much better to use some drawing software. So almost certainly that diagram had nothing to do with PowerPoint, but it was conflated with PowerPointism. And we had a long spiel about PowerPoint makes us stupid and some problems in the world are not bulletizable by various people. And I totally accept that, because we all know the PowerPoint horror stories about how you know, the Challenger disasters have been put down to PowerPoint problems that the engineers had to simplify too much, which is the same kind of issue. But this particular diagram is not a PowerPoint diagram. What we need to ask ourselves is the infamous Afghan slide fit for purpose for its task? And in fact, that's meant to be no. I've got the yes and no, a little bit rushed doing my slides this morning. Yes and no is completely reversed. But it's just to make sure you're awake. Yeah. So the first one, it's meant to be no, it's not fit for purpose. So I have a lot of sympathy for the people. I don't want to take the piss out of those people at all. I think those people drawing the model, I have a lot of sympathy. And also, there's some good technical things about that model when you delve into it. But it wasn't fit for purpose because it got that adverse reaction from a very powerful person, and no one ever wants that kind of reaction from someone like that. Should outcomes models visualization be rejected? Oh God, I've completely lost it. Yes and no's. Anyway, I think that bottom is a Jen, can you help me? Anyway, I don't know. Work it out yourself. But basically, what I'm trying, sort of in my own way, to say is that the slide wasn't fit for purpose, but we shouldn't reject visualization of outcomes because that particular slide wasn't fit for purpose. And lastly, there were a lot of good things about that slide if you spent time on it. So there's the outcomes theory principle. The outcomes model should be divided into modules that are both thematically meaningful and small enough to allow rapid scanning. Because again, we've got a psychological problem. I've drawn diagrams like that. There may be other people who want to come to me afterwards and confess to having drawn diagrams like that in the past. And the problem is what we need to do is to work out how normal human beings can understand them. Because the problem is after you've drawn them, after about a week, you can't understand the diagram anymore, and that's slightly embarrassing. But what we need to do is to be able to have ones which are thematically meaningful but in chunks. It's just that modularization thing which has taken over the world. We've got containers, we've got modular software. Basically the power of breaking things into modules makes a lot of problems which are intractable, like tractable. So the way I would have set up that model, and this was just based on taking the stuff, they actually did have a modular model. They hadn't just modularized it. They actually, if you looked at the model, it was actually in chunks. They just hadn't visualized it in a way that normal humans could understand. So part of our work with this DoView software has been the insight, and I was working with my son who was a visualization expert doing a PhD, in fact, who's run off to work for Microsoft, unfortunately. But what we sat down and thought, we're trying to help people visualize something. And so what we came up with, the idea was breaking all of our models up into chunks that people can see in a normal sized room and work with. And so a model like that Afghan one should be broken into chunks, and then people can process it. So this would be like a very simple high-level review. I haven't got everything in there, but we could easily include all of the different levels which they had within that model. But there's like successful outcome for Afghanistan, well-functioning central government, sufficient coalition capacity and right priorities, good tribal governance, illegal narcotics. See how we just basically took those what were coloured headings in the model and put them into boxes. And then within the when we're building within our software or within this approach, you drill down. So we just focus on the sufficient coalition capacity and right priorities. Coalition understands social structures. Coalition adapts an approach fit to Afghanistan. Coalition sufficiently accepting of Afghan approaches. See how now if McChrystal can't understand that, then I think he's got a problem rather than the rest of us, basically, because once you break it down, people can understand. You know, it is entirely tractable, and you could break it. This is also breaking down the population support. So you see how by breaking into chunks, and the thing is to break it into chunks, but also have those chunks labelled in thematically associated areas, so the human mind can develop a little picture of what they're trying to do in each of those areas. So a recent one of our DoView models, for instance, was along these lines about a program, quite a complex model, you know, with many different facets, was shown to a minister here in Wellington who commented it was clearly showed what was happening within the program, and they wanted other projects presented in this way. So decision makers, if you put it in the right way, if you break it into things that a normal person can understand, decision makers become very open to this type of modelling. If you do it in the wrong way, then they close it down with a comment like that, and it's quite disastrous. So the first point about, well, one of the principles of outcomes theory is break it into thematically interesting sections and keep it simple. Now I know that sounds utterly simple and utterly common sense, but the fact that someone who's trying to run a war in Afghanistan is ending up with those sorts of diagrams shows that that common sense is not widely implemented yet in the world. So another principle here is keep all levels of a program's outcomes model should be visible. Now again, sort of seemingly incredibly a truism, but it's really the idea that you need to make visible all levels of an outcomes model. So let's look at this. The Iraq invasion, absence of planning, what to do after taking Baghdad. There's a kind of a frightening book called Fiasco by a guy called Ricks, which if you read it is one of those, a great thing about America, they put out really big books. In New Zealand we don't have time to read those books. I'm trying to look for the summary, but sometimes the summary's not there. Anyway, this is a really, really big book, a very depressing book because it just details in utter detail the failure of planning around the Iraq war, and quotes he says, the author says, in 18 months, this is not just an op-ed or something. This guy just, if you read the book, you're just in awe of he talked to everybody who knew anything about anything. So in his summary, in 18 months of planning, the key question was left substantially unaddressed: what to do after getting to Baghdad. So basically the whole planning had focused on what do we do when we get to Baghdad, and there was complete resistance. There was planning happening in certain other places, but there was a lot of resistance from the centre for actually even thinking about what happens. Franks, the guy in command, actually said, I'll get you to Baghdad, and then you think about what happens after that. And then there's endless people talking about the importance of planning beforehand. But it wasn't done. And then this is an official army historian. This is in May 2004, so this is after the invasion had been going for about a year or so. There's no single plan as of 1 May 2004 that described an executable approach to the stated strategic end state of the war. Now, I mean, that's just incredibly embarrassing, basically, isn't it? If you know what I mean. Like this is the most powerful country in the world, with the most powerful administration, with the most resources in the world, but unfortunately, they weren't able to translate that into a viable plan. So it's and there's no criticism, particularly of the people involved. It's a structural problem, obviously, because everybody would want to achieve successful outcomes. But we need to look at what's the structural problem that left. And in outcomes theory terms, we just describe it as all parts of an outcomes model need to be visualized. I know that sounds kind of a bit trivial. That's just a graph. This is the actual. This has been the war. This is after the war had. This is after it got to Baghdad. So that's the escalating violence that occurred in the period after the victory had been achieved. So really, the model that Rumsfeld and people were working with. This is the visual model of what they were working with. Rumsfeld and others were working. Basically, sufficient planning for initial military victory, sufficient resources made available, well-implemented invasion, Saddam Hussein overthrown, threat of the use of weapons of mass destruction reduced, and support for terrorism reduced, and a positive outcome for Iraq, Middle East, and the rest of the world. That was the mental model that people were working on. But it unfortunately had left, basically it left, there was a box not in the model. I know it sounds incredibly simple, but basically from my point of view, there was simply a box not in the model, And that was the box, what's transitioning Iraq to a modern democracy. So, and obviously if we drill down under that, we've got restoring civil order, governance, restoring civil society, local governance, all that kind of stuff. A major undertaking, obviously. And then if we drill down further, for instance, what would proper visual planning look like underneath that one box? I've here got some work that we were, I can't show you the details, but we built a huge DoView, one of our DoView models for Sarah to reconstruct Christchurch. And this is, so you can see these are all individual sections of visual models, and that's just about reconstructing a city after it had an earthquake. Obviously, to reconstruct Iraq, you need a lot of boxes. But the main point is, if we go to that diagram, there was argument. Here's Colin Powell arguing with Rumsfeld, as Condoleezza Rice watches on, about the planning, because the State Department under Powell was doing some planning, but Rumsfeld was resisting the planning, as seems to be the story emerges from when you look at the literature. So the thing is there any mechanism that could surface this apparent endless disagreement about what should be happening? And I know it sounds incredibly simple, but if we mandated everybody visualize their plan, say there was a rule, and you know, it's a bit megalomaniacal, but say there's a rule that Rumsfeld had to produce a visual model of his plan, then everybody would say, well, that's all very well and good, but what's under the arrow, wouldn't they? Immediately the eye would be drawn. It's all very, thank you very much, but what is under that arrow? And then he would have to he'd be forced to come up with some kind of response. Now, this is a total fantasy world of my own construction, and I could force people to do visual models, particularly in our software. It would be great if we did. But you can see if we did have, to me it's just like good practice. Like in accounting, people are forced to do certain things. You know, they're just forced to do them. If they don't, they'll get fired and they get deregistered. And it would be good if somehow we introduced a culture of forcing people to expose their logic like this in a public way, which would enable people to critique it, because it's very easy, as we all know, it's very easy if we just have lots of documents and press releases and all the flummery which goes around these things. It's actually very easy to hide with smoke and mirrors that there's a gap in this model. It's incredibly easy to hide that. But if you force the discipline of visualization, we could drive, it's really just making transparent and exposing a flaw in a logic. No more complicated than that. So that's a little take on that. Now I want to move away from military examples to another one around No Child Left Behind and national standards, which is our kind of version of that. So No Child Left Behind is a measurement approach. You know, people familiar in the US with measuring outcomes of schools. So there's an outcomes theory principle: equality of inputs, equality of outcome, the level playing field principle. And again, it's just a really matter of applying. So what we have a situation, people want to measure the outcomes of schools, which is a great idea, measuring the outcomes of schools. And then the question is, how do they apply that? So I was at a conference in, as part of the Fulbright, I was at a conference in Evaluators Conference, and they were presenting on No Child Left Behind. And basically the presenters were incensed. And what they're incensed about was there was a locality where there was a English as a second language school. So by definition, imagine this was a school and all the kids in here couldn't speak English. Okay, so then No Child Left Behind was run on that. And then they found that they were failing in regard to English. So the evaluators were just almost speechless by the inanity of this entire thing. Now I must say that things have changed, and as No Child Left Behind gets more sophisticated, and I'm in touch with some of the people in the States who are doing work on measuring other things apart from just raw outputs. But the evaluators' critique, though, seemed, and this is one of the things that drove me to thinking more and more about outcomes theory as a technical exercise. Their critique was kind of a moral and a political critique. They didn't like George Bush. They thought this thing was terrible, and it seemed to me they were sort of standing up the front ranting about politics and not liking, you know, almost not liking individuals. It, to me, seemed not particularly useful, regardless of what your feelings were about particular politicians, etc. In outcomes theory, what we want to do is formulate the problem technically. So this is just simply a technical issue. It's not. It does have an emotional component, but it can be seen as just a technical mistake rather than a great kind of moral crisis. If we have two schools, we've got a school where students start at level 3 and the other school, school B, they start at level 3. Everyone happy about that? So they're starting at the same level. And teachers in school A do some magic with the kids, and then students come out at level 5 in school A, they come out at level 4 in school B. We'd all be pretty happy that that was a kind of reasonable comparison of the school, other things being equal. And that's the kind of mental model that people have about No Child Left Behind and national standard sort of approaches. However, if schools start at level 4, school A, and students come out at level 5, but students in school B start at level 2 and come out at level 4, then, you know, which school is better? And particularly if our focus happens to be, perhaps our focus, you know, part of the rhetoric about this is that our focus is on helping kids in this sort of predicament. Maybe this school is actually doing a better job than that school. So this is what we call added value measures. So really what you're interested in, do the teachers, how much value do they add? Now, again, it's incredibly simple. Like, why do I have to stand up here and say this, if you know what I mean? I mean, this is just utter common sense, isn't it? But the problem is because of the lack of a technical formulation of like a principle or a rule within a clear conceptual structure means people can't say, you know, everybody has to fight their own battles in every sector. You know, this is what they're doing here. Someone else is fighting a battle in another sector, in health, all these different sectors. People are fighting exactly the same technical issues, but without the benefit of a common language. So what we're trying to do is introduce a common language and then get that out in public. So here's the op-ed I had. And we want to translate into stuff that people can understand. So if you're looking for a farmer, so this is an op-ed about national standards. If you're looking for a farmer who is good at raising stock in difficult conditions, you'd not just focus on their raw outcomes, rather you look at how much they improve the stock they're working with. And so we need to, you know, that's obviously just trying to put it in common language. And my suggestion was that not that you abandon national standards, but you look at whether what's feasible in terms of added value or not, which is exactly what's happening in some reaches of No Child Left Behind now in states, where there's quite sophisticated analyses of added value rather than just raw scores. But everyone sort of get that idea of trying to apply these principles at that sort of level. Okay, so summary of that outcomes theory section. Outcomes theory principles enable a clearer analysis of issues and outcome systems. These can be outcome systems in any sector. A generalized language enables problems and solutions in working with outcome systems to be transferred between sectors, and currently different languages in different sectors that are quite confused. Everyone okay about that? So that's moving off the outcomes theory section, and I just want to sort of start moving towards conclusion about how we can apply these insights in practice. So what we want to do is encourage people to have formal outcome systems underpinning their strategic discussions. So what we've got at the moment is people like produce, you know, SOIs. Who knows what? Everyone here would certainly, no one's allowed here if they don't know what an SOI is. So an SOI, you know, or an outcomes report, people often produce a SOI or all sorts of often glossy outcomes reports without any idea of having something underpinning that, as I've already said. But imagine if I produced a set of accounts and the auditor turned up and said, well, that's all very well and good, but where's your outcome system? It would just be incomprehensible. So I haven't got any outcome system. Sorry, I haven't got any accounting system. What are you talking about? You know, and it's exactly the same. And when I talk to people like the Auditor General, she's totally clear that what they're trying to do with their push around accountability, etc., is not just have a good report, you know, not just have a good SOI, but to have people having an outcome system, and then the SOI or anything else is actually the product of that outcome system. So it's really reconfiguring the thinking around that. So if we're going to walk around town telling people to have outcome systems, we need to, you know, if we want to be credible, but also if we want to make any money, we need to be able to offer them some sort of system. So we have an approach. It's not the only approach, but it is an approach to thinking about this. And the point about our approach is it embeds those principles of outcomes theory in it. So we think it's conceptually sound. So the DoView visual outcomes planning is a practical approach that embeds outcomes theory and a visualization-based approach to strategic planning. DoView software, and then we developed the software, as I said, because we couldn't find anything else. We used all sorts of drawing packages, but we couldn't find anything where we could work in a room with people and kind of, what I'm trying to do is extract the mental model that people have and get it onto the wall. So I was up in Martinborough with this thing called Fairway, a government-owned disputes resolution company. I was with them in Martinborough yesterday. And what we're doing with the board was basically trying to figure out what are you guys trying to do, and then let's get it up into this model on the board, and the software is, I won't show you the software today, but it's designed to do that. It's very agile, kind of like a Swiss Army pocket knife, very easy to do that, as opposed to drawing software, which is all about drawing wonderful diagrams. The little bit of software is about actually getting stuff out of people's heads. But from the psychological point of view, whether it's our software or anyone else's, the main point is letting people own the product that they're producing on the wall. And there's certain software design characteristics you have to build in. You don't want it to be too fiddly, you want it to be easy, etc., etc. So, so let's just talk about this DoView visual outcomes planning process, which is the embodiment of outcomes theory. So the idea is in any area we build an outcomes model. Okay, so basically one of those models, and I'll show you one in a minute. We can use that model, and again I won't go in because I haven't got time and it's not one of sort of a boring worky kind of presentation. You can use that model to visually do what we call line of sight. So you can use the model to identify priorities, and then you can show your projects are visually mapped up onto those priorities within the visual model. Just the power of visualization. Very powerful, much more powerful than just a narrative explanation. Measuring setting accountabilities is just then about putting your indicators onto your model, and it's very, very powerful, because who's been an indicator exercise, a blank piece of paper, and people say, what are your KPIs? I don't know if you've been, heads nodding in the room. almost impossible for a human to figure out what they are, because you have to have a mental model, and if there's 3 people in the room, they have 3 different mental models, and they're producing different indicators around those mental models. So in this stage, we actually just pop the indicators onto the visual model next to them, a much faster and more fluid way of doing that. Evaluate success, we weave an evaluation of impact, which is more one-off studies to looking at success, and then you can dashboard your results. So that's pretty much how that works, and the main point about this is you can kind of mix and match those processes. So here, so see, this is the outcomes model. And I got onto that. So the outcomes model, so if we're doing planning, we do the outcomes model and we do the line of sight. If we're doing monitoring, we do the outcomes model and we measure indicators. And then we do some reporting back. If we're doing evaluation, we do the outcomes model, we do evaluation. See how we can build it up? So just to quickly look at the doc example. So here's an example of doc. We've done their strategic planning a couple of years ago. Now we're redoing it visually. So here's their vision and mission statement, which I'm happy people put anything on that end of the model, because that's fantastic. But we're trying to protect this technical modelling here within this, and we have drill downs into each of those each of these aspects of the model here. So everyone see how we're drilling down? That's just under the natural heritage one. We're going back to the top, and then we drill down like that. This one's about recreation, etc. So everyone see how we do that? Now, I'll just make one tiny technical point. You won't be able to read that, but normally when I do these sessions, I would do it in a room where we had a really big screen and we were able to visualize that. So it's really important that if we were building this model, that we deal with it as a visualization exercise. And if you get up on my blog, on that DoView.com blog, you'll find me ranting and raving about rooms all around the world that aren't set up for visualization. I was in Italy and Rome a while ago. They're just small screens, and then so I said, can we put something up on the wall? I just went, no, you can't. You know, the Italian, well, maybe Italians here, but you know, you can't touch the wall. You can't put blue tack on the wall. You can't do anything like that. So the whole room was set up to look great, but it wasn't a working room. A working room needs to allow for visualization both on screens and on and sticking stuff all over the walls if we're going to leverage visualization. That's a little bugbear for the day. Okay, so just to sort of draw to a conclusion, outcomes theory, DoView planning, it's an approach based on visual planning. Aspects of it used in most government departments in New Zealand, not fully, but like DOC is doing the whole kind of deal. Other organisations are doing parts of it for various purposes. We've probably modelled actually about half of the government, half the public sector in Wellington we have visual models of. It's used internationally. I've been in Indonesia. They had their 4,000 outcomes, and so they've got me involved in teaching them how to draw visual models. So that's kind of fun, seeing those visual models come up in Indonesian as they build within our software the sub parts of the models. And we had a bit of fun over there, and I was just talking all day to an Indonesian group of public servants who I must say are exactly same mindset as New Zealand public servants. Really quite interesting, almost interchangeable. These are technicians within the Ministry of Finance. Anyway, I was talking all day, and I said to this guy, "How did it go?" And he said, "Well, he said it's okay, but what's the thing about the Christians?" And there's obviously just about everyone there is Muslim. And I said, what thing about the Christians? And he said, well, but every 20 minutes you say, are there any Christians? and so I say, but fortunately got out of that without any. Next time they had a simultaneous translator. So when I went back a few months later, it was all simultaneous translation to avoid that. Lots of people use our approach and our software for health promotion in the States, all through natural resource management in Australia. It was recently used in Denmark for a $3.5 billion refit of their railway system. Our DoView software is used to plan the benefits from that. So it's kind of used all over the place. Simple tool for communicating what your project's doing. So I think that's almost my last slide, or maybe it is my last slide. Oh, just a few resources which I'll leave up there for you. So you can find out more nitty-gritty stuff about outcomes theory, simplified up on that site. I blog all the time about this stuff, so if you're obsessed with it, it's a place to go if you can't sleep at night. On Twitter, and there's a community of practice on LinkedIn. So if you go to tiny URL DoView Planning LN, you can find out, can chat about it, any questions, and that's our contacts. But just in conclusion, thanks for Fulbright for the opportunity to go to the States. It was really, really very useful. We had a lot of fun over there. It was a good time. And thanks also for the opportunity to talk here. But that's really what we're trying to do, what's grown out of my earlier work and my Fulbright experience has really now blossomed into this other work that we're involved in doing, and it's nice to see some of that go back to the States. In fact, US Treasury uses our software, I think, and was that the Republican, was that group? Anyways, the International Republican Institute. We're just talking to them at the moment about having more copies of our software. They've got some. So thank you very much. Great.